Hi, welcome to Culture and Causation. I'm Aaron Briley, and my guest today is Dr. Neal McCluskey, who wrote an article I want to discuss titled Myths Shouldn't Block Educational Freedom. Here's the Truth About School Choice. Dr. McCluskey is the director of Cato's Center for Educational Freedom, and he's the author of Feds in the Classroom, How Big Government Corrupts, Cripples, and Compromises American Education. He's on the editorial board of the Journal of School Choice, and his writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and others. I think the public desperately needs to know more about school choice, and I'm always happy to discuss this topic on the show. Neal, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Great, thank you. Now, in the article, you discuss how Iowa passed a new bill in the Senate, and this was back in February, but it still needs to be passed in the House, which is called Senate File 159, and has in it something called the Student First Scholarship, which is an education savings account. Can you tell us more about what that is and how it works?
Sure. So the good news is that legislation was eventually passed by the legislature in Iowa and signed by the governor. So it's now law. We've seen numerous states in the last few months either create new school choice programs or expand school choice programs that they already had. Education savings accounts are one, an increasingly popular way to deliver school choice, but there are also vouchers, scholarship tax credits. And then beyond private school choice, we have charter schools and other options. And so Iowa decided to go the route of education savings accounts. And what's particularly powerful about an education savings account is you can use that money not just for what typically a voucher is, which is, hey, if you want to choose a private school, you essentially take the money that would have been spent on your child in a public school, and you say, I want to take some of that and pay for a private school. The education savings account says, go ahead and do that if you want, but you can use this money for all sorts of other educational options. You could use it to purchase tutoring. You could use it to purchase curricular materials if you are teaching your child at home. It has a whole lot more uses than a voucher. And so the illustration people like to use is, a voucher was like the old flip phone where you could go around different places, you could make phone calls. You were no longer tethered to the wall of your kitchen like it used to be with phones for a very long time. And that portability was great. But the education savings account is more like your smartphone, where you can use it to make calls, sure, but you can also send text, email, play video games, all sorts of other things with it. And so education savings accounts give the account holders a whole lot more options than they had under vouchers, and certainly that they had in the absence of school choice.
Okay, and is this, now this is in Iowa, do we see any trends that this will be adopted by more states?
Yeah, we've seen numerous states adopt all sorts of different policies, including education savings accounts. We sort of hit a major milestone of sorts, at least psychologically, a few months ago, when almost on the same day, West Virginia and Kentucky both passed new school choice programs, again, almost on the same day. In the case of, I think it was Kentucky, that they had to actually overrule a governor's veto. And so that was sort of symbolic of a major trend we've been in really since the beginning of 2021 of schools creating new school choice or expanding school choice. Again, often with education savings accounts. In some cases, they're education savings accounts where people can donate to groups that put together savings accounts, and those donors get a tax credit. So it's like a scholarship tax credit and ESA combined. We've seen vouchers, we've seen all sorts of things. So with little doubt, the major driver of this trend in 2021 has been COVID-19. And families who have been presented with only one option for how to educate their kids. And usually if it was a public school, the option was you have to have your child learning remotely. Most private schools do not offer in-person schooling, but in-person education tends to be much more effective for most kids, not all kids, but for most kids. And so you had a lot of people, even in quote unquote good school districts, the school districts that usually get high test scores, you had them saying, look, this isn't working for us. We've got to have something different. And they realized the only way to do that is to let money follow students to the options that were best for those kids. And so we've seen a real sweep of new school choice nationwide.
That's really encouraging. Now, you were discussing school vouchers, and I want to just sort of go into the weeds a bit with this. How much tuition do they cover, and what's the process for voucher distribution? Is there some sort of lottery? Um, and maybe can they be used for all private schools, both secular and religious private schools too? So
Yeah,
just maybe, yeah, just some details about the voucher programs at a
right.
private.
So the first thing that has to be pointed out with any of these school choice programs is they vary from state to state. The states are still primarily in charge of education constitutionally. That's where the power should be, states or local governments or individuals. It shouldn't be with the federal government. So that's why we have this decentralization. The Constitution gives the federal government no authority to legislate or to govern education. And so all these programs are going to vary from state to state. But generally speaking, a voucher program, it gives you maybe 4,500, maybe $500. It really depends, though. Some voucher programs are only for kids with disabilities. Those will have higher amounts typically. Some will have different amounts depending on somebody's income. So this is, again, very general, but it may be 5,000, it could be 6,000, 7,000, usually some share of what a student would have gotten in the public schools can follow them to a private school. Sometimes that's roughly the state's share of funding. And so, but it's around 6,000 or 7,000, again, varying a great deal by state. Whether or not you can take it to a religious school, to my knowledge, there are no longer any voucher programs, true voucher programs, that say you cannot take this to a religious school. The reason for that is there's now a long trail of Supreme Court cases that have said, basically, if you're going to supply school choice, you're going to have a school choice program, you have to allow people to take that money to a religious private school. And so there was Espinoza v. Montana, who was the most recent Supreme Court ruling, which was last, I guess, 2 sessions ago. And it challenged, people in Montana challenged a Montana program that said, well, you can take, I think it was a voucher to any school you want as long as it's not religious. And the Supreme Court said, well, that's not okay. You can't specifically exclude religious schools. Now, the reason I say kind of true vouchers, or where money, as the principle is the money is attached to the student, is there are 2 states, actually 3 now, but Maine and Vermont, that had something called town tuitioning for a long time. New Hampshire now has it as well, but Maine and Vermont said, look, we have some towns that aren't big enough to support a high school. Usually it's a high school. And so instead of trying to pay for something we can't afford, we'll just give money to families in this district that they can use to go purchase education at a private school. And Maine, though, said you can go to any private school you want, except for a religious school in which the religion is taught or the religion informs how the school is run. They tried to draw this distinction between religious status and religious use. You could be a religious school, but they won't pay for anybody to go get religion. And so there is a case that the Supreme Court just accepted. I think it's called Macon versus Carson, although I may be spelling the names wrong and may have just reversed their order. But the Supreme Court just accepted it. That takes on the status versus use distinction, where you, depending on how the court rules, even these town tuitioning programs could no longer exclude religious schools based on use as opposed to status. So they are trying to thread the needle by saying it's fine if it's a religious school, but not if it does anything religious. And that could also fall by the wayside.
I see. And what's the process for distribution? Is it a lottery system, or how does it work? Do people just apply for a voucher, and if they meet the criteria, they automatically get accepted?
There are actually lotteries to get vouchers. We see the lottery sometimes to get into a school, but also, yes, lotteries to get into vouchers. And so I don't know how many states have those. Some states have enough school choice that they don't need to use lotteries. So usually the first way you qualify is if it's a special needs voucher, you are special needs. If it's often it is for kids who are low income, you have to be low income. Sometimes it's for if you're in a public school that, your state has an A through F rating of schools, you have to be in an A or B rate. A D or an F rated school to get it. So you have lots of sorting that way. But within that, yes, you do have lotteries in order to get a voucher.
And do vouchers improve academic performance? I mean, I would assume they do, but is there data on this, or do you know?
Yeah, it's the area where we have sort of the least conclusive evidence of school choice helping is in test scores. So many of the early voucher programs, we found that yes, there is some test score advantage for kids who, through those lotteries, some got choice and some didn't. So you would compare the kids who got choice with those who didn't get a lottery or a voucher, and you see how did they do, and you can also then split that between those who received a voucher and used it to go to a private school and those who didn't. And so what those lotteries or those comparisons tended to show was some minor academic advantage for the private schools. Sometimes it was just in one subject or one group of kids, but it wasn't typically huge in terms of test scores. Some more recent studies have actually found some negative results in Louisiana, and in DC they found there's sort of a wash. But it's important to understand how these programs are constructed. So for instance, in Louisiana, there are lots of rules and regulations a private school would have to follow if they wanted to participate. So what we saw was that the top performing private schools just said, well, we don't want to have to be held to state standards and state accountability, and so we're not going to participate. That means what we could be seeing is an effect of constrained choice, not of school choice.
It almost seems like, if I could just interject, almost seems like you have these private schools that because of regulations are being turned into de facto public schools almost.
Well, sort of.
Not quite, but you mean if you're putting all these restrictions on a school and what they can do, yeah, it would seem that, they're taking, like you said, there's a constrained choice. These private schools don't have all the freedom maybe to, I don't know, design curriculum and teach the way that they want to.
Yeah. So Louisiana is sort of it's a warning for people that if you try and make private schools that participate in school choice into public schools, make them do the same thing you want public schools do, which is typically to be held accountable to standardized tests. Many private schools are just going to say no, because the reason those private schools exist is to be something different from what the public schools are. And so if you regulate the program enough, they won't participate. We have seen Wisconsin and Milwaukee in particular is the oldest of sort of the modern school choice programs going back to 1990. And it has seen some regulation over time. The private schools are still not the same as public schools, but there has been some regulation that sort of constrained what they do, their accountability for tests, whether or not they can require people or students to participate in religious functions that they may have. This is why we've actually, at least at Cato, people have tended to prefer scholarship tax credits. A voucher tends to carry more regulations because taxpayers say, well, that's my money going to somebody to choose a school. I may not like what that school does, and as a taxpayer, I had no choice. A scholarship tax credit or a tax credit connected ESA, the donors choose. They say, I'll choose whether or not to donate to a group that gives out vouchers, and depending on how it's constructed, they can also choose to whom they give that money. It could be Catholic schools, Montessori schools, anything like that. So vouchers are kind of like the oldest way to deliver school choice, still much better than not having vouchers. But the movement has moved away from vouchers toward other delivery mechanisms that aren't as likely to be regulated. But much of the research on academic outcomes, test score outcomes, has been based on vouchers. Importantly, there's pretty clear evidence that school choice leads to significantly higher graduation rates. So if your academic measure is attainment of education, then we have pretty clear evidence that school choice works.
Great. Now, school choice seems like an unmitigated good. I mean, all the certain programs that we have now that you just spoke of, it seems like an unmitigated good until perhaps maybe schools become completely privatized and are competing for students on the free market. But I want to know, where's the opposition to school choice really coming from? Like, what are the criticisms? And I believe in your article, you called them myths. So what are these myths that are opposed to school choice, and how would you respond?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of myths. The book is called School Choice Myths, and it addresses sort of the 12 biggest myths, at least the ones we thought of as biggest at the time. It's edited by me and Corey DeAngelis, but it's a compilation of different authors writing on different things. And what we've seen in particular, as we've had this wave of states debating school choice, is that the number one myth is that school choice, quote unquote, siphons money from public schools. And so this sort of taps into a very readily observed problem, or at least predilection, which is that people are much more motivated not to lose something than they are to potentially gain something. And so most people, when you look at polling, if they could have school choice, they'd want it. But more concrete is when people say, well, if somebody gets school choice, you're going to lose money from your schools. This is what we see teachers unions say all the time. This is what we see administrators associations say. And the idea is, well, there's only so much state, usually money, or state and local money. And if you can take some of it to a private school, that means there's less for a public school. And there's some truth to that, and that, okay, well, if you think of it as just a pie, and a big part of the pie is public schools, and then you let people take some of that piece over to private schools, yes, the public schools have lost some money. The assumption underlying it is that that money belongs to public schools, as opposed to that money is supposed to educate students. If the idea is it's supposed to educate students, nobody's lost anything. It's just going to a different group of people to educate students. And that's where it gets really interesting, because private schools in school choice programs almost always cost much less per pupil than the public schools do. So then on a per pupil basis, we're actually saving money through private schools and through school choice. And even more interesting, when those students only take some of the money to educate them to the private schools, the remainder stays with the public schools, who then have more money to spend per pupil. And that gives them, more power, especially when people say, well, we need more money per pupil, we need smaller class size. It's almost a win-win in that the people who want something different, a private education, get it, and a whole lot of extra resources remain for those kids who are still in the public schools.
Wow. Now, you said in the article also that 26 out of 28 studies show that public schools serve children better when that district has school choice. And I think you just mentioned it now. Is that why it's the case? Because there is more money left over. There's this remainder left over to spend on the existing students?
Yeah, that could be part of the answer. Is there are now more resources available for those kids still in the public schools. But it seems more likely, or at least more powerful, is that when a public school has to compete to hold on to students, it ups its performance. And that's sort of what we'd expect from basic observing of human nature, of economies, is that when there's a chance you will lose something you want to other people, you try and do better. You try and attract people back to you. I mean, this is what we see in the free market all the time. And by the way, it always irks me because people say, well, what you're really then saying is it should all be about competition and winners and losers. But that's not really what this is about. the way this competition works is you have these people called students and families, and they say, well, we want the best education we can get. When you only have one producer, the monopoly, public schools, well, you're stuck with whatever it is. You open up that private school, suddenly they say, I can get something better. That family wins, and then that private school wins. That's a win-win. Yes, the public schools then lose students, and maybe that's a loss for them, but the idea is not you have winners and losers. It's then you have the public schools up their game. Suddenly we see everybody starting to end up better off as a result of this. And so that is probably what we're seeing, is that public schools that face competition have to try and do better.
That's fantastic. And that's a great way to sort of see this idea of competition, how competition in education, as well as in, in technology and everywhere else in the economy, just makes all the services and products much better. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we go?
Well, I would just say people should continue to watch the school choice space. This has been, I think it was 2011, the Wall Street Journal declared that year the year of school choice. And there was a lot of good school choice that year, but we've eclipsed the new school choice programs and expansions of that year in 2021. So people where you live are going to see a lot more school choice, and the school choice movement has gained a lot of ground in the last 6 or 7 months.
And my last question for you, Neal, is where can people find you and your work online?
Sure. I'm at the Cato Institute. You can go to www.cato.org. And you can look up, you can go under issues, you can find education. You can just Google me, Neal McCluskey, and you'll find all my Cato stuff. And you can find the book, School Choice Myths, wherever fine books are sold.
Okay, fantastic. And I'll make sure to link to your bio, to that website, and to your book in the show notes. And thank you so much for a great interview, Neal. I enjoyed it.
Sure. Thank you.